going to say it also extends to platforms like ChatGPT. Like a couple weeks ago, we had tested like asking ChatGPT, can you explain the function of the clitoris? And it gave a content warning. But then, can you explain the function of the penis? It didn't give a content warning. So it's really like, why is vagina a bad word and penis isn't, right?
That is crazy. Welcome back to the Evergreen RX. I'm your host, Hayden, licensed mental health therapist, Cancer Moon, and the first to get deep at any party. And I am so excited because today we are joined by Carol Wersbe from the Center for Intimacy Justice. Carol is a global health professional and sexual reproductive health and rights advocate. She's worked in law and policy. She has helped address domestic abuse survivor needs in LA County, and now she's at the Center for Intimacy Justice. Carol is originally from Southern California, but now she's coming to the podcast all the way from Copenhagen. So it's pretty exciting having someone all the way out in Denmark joining us, getting that time zone scheduling figured out. But I'm so excited to have her.
Hayden, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, so I kind of just want to jump in. So at least for listeners to lay like a little bit of groundwork, we're hoping to just kind of talk about what intimacy justice is, why it matters to women and to people in general, to our society in general. Kind of look at the impact of intimacy justice in the online social space, and then maybe talk some about how young women in particular can kind of address or work with intimacy justice in their own life or kind of advocate for themselves, what we can do about it.
Awesome. That sounds great. I'm so excited to get into it.
Yeah. So if you can first kind of talk to us maybe a little bit about how intimacy justice became a large part of your work, how you got into it, and what it really means.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So intimacy justice, when we're talking about intimacy justice, I work at the Center for Intimacy Justice. So I'm the chief of staff. I've actually been with them for 5 years now. Since I was in my undergrad, I started as a volunteer and then worked my way up to my current position. And the term intimacy justice is actually derived from an academic named Sarah McClellan. And it was coined as like a very theoretical term. And then the Center for Intimacy Justice kind of, nods to that term. And I think the framework that we're really thinking about intimacy justice from is that all people, regardless of gender, should have access to information about their health and also have equitable, joyful, pleasurable, intimate lives. And there's so many barriers in our current society that are really making that difficult. And the primary thing that the Center for Intimacy Justice focuses on right now is really digital suppression and the digital censorship of sexual and reproductive health content, products, information for women. And when I say the term women, I also mean like women and people of diverse genders. So that's intended to include non-binary people, trans people, and, health information for those groups or, half the population is extremely digitally suppressed. And so that's really like our core focus at the moment.
Yeah, so that's interesting because for anybody that might look y'all up after, is like looking at your stuff while listening, you can see on your social media, on your website, some of those ads that have been restricted on like from Meta and other social platforms, things for, informing people about endometriosis pain. And I mean, the craziest stuff that's been rejected. So it sounds like right now the digital focus is kind of what y'all are honing in on, but that this center kind of does intimacy justice or is interested in it all across the board. Social is just kind of one avenue.
Yeah, definitely. We are a really young organization. We've only been around since 2019 in the infancy, and then we released our first research in 2022. So I think when we're thinking about like broad dreaming, yeah, definitely we want to focus on other things. Like I know we're really, really interested in restorative justice,
Mhm.
in, preventing sexual harm. But as you said, digital suppression is definitely our primary program area at the moment because we're really concerned about the discriminatory censorship of sexual health information online. And as you said, like endometriosis is a great example. Like people really should be able to access information and products about menstrual health conditions, and they just at the moment simply cannot, or can't to the scale that they should be able to.
Yeah, for sure. So that kind of makes me wonder, like, from your experience and being so steeped in
Steeped
this
in this
world and
world.
so aware of the inadequacies, I wonder how you maybe could articulate the differences in experience for women or people of diverse gender using the internet, being online, and kind of versus what we would think of with like men's experience of being online based off of like the restrictions to education and just also representation of certain experiences on the internet.
Definitely. That's a really good question. And maybe it would be also helpful for me to kind of like rewind and kind of talk about why we started like looking at this digital suppression work. And that would probably give like more context potentially. Does that sound
Yeah,
okay?
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So the Center for Intimacy Justice was founded by our CEO, Jackie Rotman. And Jackie was basically speaking with a bunch of women's health organizations and companies. And she was actually looking to start a venture fund because, like, another huge issue in the space of, femtech, sex tech, et cetera, is that, um, businesses, companies with novel products, they can't get funding from venture capital. So much of the funding goes to companies founded by men, right? So Jackie, our CEO, was speaking with all of these femtech brands, and far and wide, then one of the things that they cited that they were really struggling with was that they could not advertise on Facebook. And at the time, and now there's like a lot more social media companies that are relevant, but at the time, Facebook and Instagram are really huge tools that businesses use to grow and to reach their primary audience. So, for example, one of the businesses that we had talked to for our first research report is this company called Onut. I don't know if you've heard of them, but
Mm,
they create a device to basically limit penetration length, and it's for people with pelvic pain, for endometriosis, and that product they weren't able to advertise it, and then they're not able to get their end user, they're not able to fundraise, so it's kind of like this ripple effect. So Jackie really identified this problem and was like, look, people who are starting their own businesses often for very personal reasons, a lot of these founders have had sexual health issues themselves, and that's what drives them and motivates them to create change in the space.
mm,
And so Jackie really identified, like, how can you both run a business and like run an advocacy campaign against the like one of the largest social media platforms in the world. So she
yeah.
was like, okay, I'm going to take this issue on. I'm going to focus on this, because it was so noticeably discriminatory. So, moving on, in 2022, we released a report in the New York Times, or Center for Intimacy Justice released a report in the New York Times after speaking with 60 businesses. And we found that across the board, all 60 of them had had an advertisement removed by Meta, so by Facebook or Instagram. And when I say these businesses had an advertisement removed, these businesses are working in the areas of menstrual health, fertility, breastfeeding, pelvic pain, these topics that are really critical that people have access to information for.
Yeah.
And it really uncovered how widespread the issue was. And then in contrast, we found a lot of advertisements for things like erectile dysfunction, ball hair, manscaping, video games that were like super sexual in nature that were totally allowed on Meta. So it showed this really stark double standard of what the platforms were allowing and what the platforms were saying, no, that's quote unquote adult or too sexual or pornographic, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that, like, to your question about what it's like to be a woman online versus a man online, I can't so speak to the experience of being a man online, but I think when we're talking about like the consumer perspective or like someone looking for sexual health information, I think it's really hard to find it, because we have these algorithmic issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy when you list the things that, the scope of businesses and what they were promoting and how all of them had rejected ads when it's like just any basically any part of like the female body, the female experience. Like, okay, yeah. So if it has something to do specifically with, you know, having a certain like female health issue, then like, okay, that's basically the line. Like it could be anything underneath that umbrella, which is just really, you know, that's it is so stark. Like I saw that research y'all did and kind of comparing the male directed ads that were like very blatant and very in your face, like ones that are like the cactus where it like looks like a penis and it's like, you know, on the side of the subway it's just plastered. And you know, it's hard to kind of wrap your head around, and kind of why, you know, I was wanting to ask this question too, is like bringing the awareness, like having you on the podcast too, to like bring some of the awareness to like these things are removed so we don't even get to see them. So it's like the absence of knowledge that we're missing something that should be there. You know, like
Exactly.
it's just you're going through TikTok or Instagram or Facebook and you're scrolling, you're seeing ads and you're seeing certain things represented, and you don't even get to understand what parts or what information that could be valuable to you that isn't even represented.
Yeah,
You
you
know,
don't know what
never
you're
crosses.
missing.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, you don't know what you're missing. But then when you really dive into it and what you're laying out here, it's like, oh, it's targeted. Like that doesn't really make sense. It's like, okay, maybe if, you know, 20 out of the 60, or maybe there's some things that are falling through the cracks, but it doesn't sound to be that way.
It's far and wide. Like you said, it's anything to do with breasts, with a vagina, with a clitoris, like with a vulva. It's really like across the board censorship. And it's also from like all ages. You know, we speak with businesses, you know, on a weekly basis who come to us and say, look, like we're having so many issues. And it's from like, you know, the beginning of kind of people's awareness of sexual and reproductive health, like, you know, when people get their periods, you know, as early as like 13 years old, to menopause. So it really, like, from, you know, menstrual health to fertility and breastfeeding, if people decide to have children, to all the way to menopause. So it's really like it's really scaling this broad part of our life. And I think that your point is really well taken, that it's like you don't know what you're missing. And I think also something that I'm like really personally interested about is like the rise of TikTok and how young people are really increasingly getting sexual health information online.
Mhm.
And one of the things that we're also seeing on platforms like TikTok, which operate very differently than Meta, but still have digital censorship very much present, is that people use different language, and they use like a 3 when they talk about the word sex, or they use an at when they talk about the word vagina. And I think it's really concerning because people have to use those terms in order to, you know, get their content out there. But at the same time, how can people then search for it? And then when they do search for it, if they find it, doesn't that perpetuate the stigma of not being
Yeah.
able to use these words?
Yeah. Yeah, it's censoring like the word vagina, which is kind of an insane concept.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of also wondering just like the larger message that you kind of feel like is being promoted by this disproportionate approval and difference between what sexual health and wellness advertisements are allowed for women's issues and then what is for men's issues.
Yeah, you know, I think there's a lot of different kind of viewpoints on this. Like some people feel that it's really intentional and very, I don't know, lack of a better word, evil. And then some people feel that it's more so coded into technology. And I think that like an interesting concept when we're talking about like the creation of these algorithms and these systems, because, you know, someone is not going and reviewing all of these ads, right? Facebook and Meta and all of these platforms get millions of pieces of content a day. And they have these like often AI driven systems to sort through this content.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the really key thing here is that there's no such thing as an unbiased algorithm. So whoever's creating these algorithms, which in the past and has been, you know, white men in the US, their kind of biases and their cultural understandings are then maybe intentionally, maybe not, I don't know, hardwired into these systems, right? So I
Yeah.
think that like the widespread rejection really just represents like where we're at culturally and kind of who's creating these platforms and what are their beliefs. And do they think that women's bodies shouldn't be allowed on the internet? I don't know. Probably not, but maybe they're not comfortable with the word vagina. Maybe they're not comfortable talking about women's health. Maybe they think, so it's like, it's kind of a complicated issue, but I do think that the work that we're doing really broadly represents how sexual health and specifically how women and people of diverse genders sexual health is really undervalued and really silenced in our culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that what you just said is so valuable, and even just looking forward as like AI becomes just increasingly used in every facet of life is like we get this idea, okay, there's AI or there's something that's kind of computer generated, and so it's like almost this non-human thing. But then you're saying like, okay, who's making the algorithm? Like there still is information that's being put in, and so it's so valuable to look at who is doing that, who is making some of these decisions or inputting the information. Because I mean, we know like, yeah, maybe someone is super uncomfortable and like is actively thinking like, oh, it's like those tampon and pads ads have always used different colors to represent blood instead of red because it's like, oh, nobody wants to see that. And it's like, okay, but there could be another person that's really not thinking so consciously about it, but there's so much unconscious bias. Like, and it's just things that people aren't even perceiving that are still impacting. And when you really look at the trickle down effect of that, it's like, okay, yeah, maybe somebody's like unconscious bias is kind of seeping through. Oh, but now ads aren't getting through. And now these female companies aren't getting the funding that they need. They aren't able to financially succeed. And it's like, okay, well, that has a huge impact. And I
Yeah,
just
the
think,
ripple is crazy. It's huge, all the way down to the consumer, all the way down to the person who's having painful sex or the person who has a really painful period and they are trying to get access to information and products and they can't.
yeah, like I think I've been surprised as I've been going along and having more guests and talking to more um, women in very diverse fields that a lot of stuff keeps coming back to technology and social media and like women's health issues. Like it's coming up so often because I just feel like it's hard to talk about a lot of different things without touching on parts of the female experience that it just seems like there's such a lack of education and information on.
Yeah, and that's also why people are turning to the internet, right? Because like we're not educating people about their sexual and reproductive health and rights in our schools. So where are people going to go? They're going to go to the internet.
Oh yeah. It
Right? Like if we were really educating people super adequately from a young age about, their bodies in our public education system, I think we would be looking at a completely different issue.
Yeah, I mean, I got my sex education one time, 6th grade in Texas. I walked away from that thinking that once you started your period, it never stopped until you had menopause.
No, I mean, literally think about that. That is the craziest thing. Also, that must be so scary. Like, that must have been such a scary experience for you to have
You're
as
like,
a
I'm
person.
like, okay, I guess I'll just bleed every day once this thing starts. Like,
Yeah. So it's like no wonder people are going to the internet. And it's such a shame because I think that like also what my work has really shown me is that there's all these wonderful people creating and innovating in the field because it's been so underserved for so long. And there's these like brilliant innovators and they're doing great work, but then there's this really external barrier there. And I think
mm-hmm.
there's also something to be said for that. Like there's this really huge wave of these of innovation right now in the women's health space, and it's so frustrating that
Yeah,
this barrier feels so out of their control. Obviously, like Center for Intimacy Justice, like we are really trying to change this, and I believe that we will. But I love like your story about thinking that you were going to bleed every single day, because I think that like a lot of people have those experiences, and they're like, you know what? I don't want my kid to have that experience, or I don't want my niece or nephew or whatever. So I'm
Hmm.
also really like optimistic in a way about like, you know, our generation being so aware of our bodies and not wanting to perpetuate that type of education, that type of energy beyond us, you know.
Yeah, even how like disconnected we can feel, like, and talking about like the mental health connection with it, it's like, if you are growing up and you're dealing with severe period pain or undiagnosed endometriosis, you don't even know endometriosis is a thing, or PMDD, like having premenstrual symptoms that are just out of the bounds of what should be normalized. I mean, even when I talk to a pelvic floor physical therapist, that's like, I think episode 14 or 15, um, she was talking about like period pain in general, like it's way too normalized. Like we really shouldn't have super painful periods. And it's crazy because you see, old movies growing up, I feel like you see the girl like laying in bed eating ice cream, people talking about how she's just PMSing, and it's like all, and it's kind of like, it's funny and like relatable, but it's also kind of got like this negative tilt on it. And I don't know, I just think it makes sense that people are turning to the internet, like you said, and there's a lot of, kind of amateur creators or educators online that maybe it's not always the most accurate information, but it's still more than no information, and it's coming from diverse sources of representation. Like I think that's a big reason why people want to go to TikTok to find out, get their recommendations, get their information, because maybe somebody that looks or sounds more like them is actually sharing it with them in a way that feels more understandable.
Definitely. Definitely. And it's so valuable to be able to go to someone who identifies the way that you identify and they can tell you about their experience. And I think that's true. I think that's the beauty of social media. So it brings so much good. It brings so much connection and opportunity for like diversity of experience. But there's this like underbelly that we really need to fix it. And to your point about like amateur creators, definitely. And there's also like so many doctors and nurses
Yeah.
and licensed professionals also on social media that are unable to reach their audience. You know, even nonprofits, like we speak with, you know, huge global nonprofits that provide reproductive health services and they cannot get their services out there. Like we got an email the other day from someone who was talking about how like when Facebook takes down their listings, which it's a service in the global South that provides reproductive health and rights care. When
Mhm.
Facebook takes down their ads, it has a direct correlation on the amount of clients or patients that they get in that given month. So it really correlates with access to care. And it's across settings because I'm talking about a healthcare provider in the global south, but it's also like the person who has endometriosis in Texas, and they're not also not able to access services. So it's like this gigantic global issue because the policies that we're looking at are often global. Like on Meta, their ad policy spans across the world, right?
Yeah.
So changing that has an impact on billions of people potentially.
Yeah. So with the kind of like uh societal pressures or cultural norms that are impacting women's experience with intimacy and with their like mental well-being, in this sense, kind of bringing in when we don't have access to this information and we're dealing with things that we don't understand, that does have an impact on our holistic well-being, on our connection with ourself. How does your work address these challenges? Like how do y'all respond, and what do you kind of see the path forward for improving these things? Like you said, you're really hopeful, and so what are you kind of like, how are you addressing these things?
Definitely. Good question. I mean, when I was kind of talking about Center for Intimacy Justice a while ago, I mentioned the report that we created in 2022 that we actually released in the New York Times. And that report was really drawing light to the issue, drawing attention, saying, look, this is a problem because I'm I think a lot of people don't know that this is an issue. And I think that it's also an issue that's very widely agreed upon as being egregious. Um, it's something that far and wide, I think people, they look at the cactus penis and then they look at the menstrual health ad and it's like, what's going on? So a lot of our work is really awareness building and saying, look
Mm-hmm.
at this problem. And it's interesting because the New York Times report really, we received over 100 different we received coverage in over 100 media outlets with that report. And often if you're targeting, like in advocacy work, if you're targeting like a company, if there's 100 stories written about a business, often that puts some public pressure on them. But I think when we're dealing with these huge tech companies, the fight is a little bit different. But
Mm,
we released that report in 2022 in January. In October, Meta silently changed their advertising policy.
mm,
And they very much used the language that we used. So we talked about pelvic pain, contraception. They then edited the policy to say pelvic pain, contraception are allowed. So it was very, very similar to the language that we use. But they did this, in the middle of the night. They did this in silent. It wasn't an announced policy change. We got really excited, right? We were like, oh my gosh, we did it. This is amazing. And then we surveyed, we have hundreds of nonprofits, businesses, content creators in a database that we use for research. And we really draw from their experiences. And we said, hey, did you guys notice a difference? And far and wide, they didn't. So from there, we filed a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission, claiming that the enforcement of Meta's advertising policies is discriminatory.
mm,
We got support from major policymakers, from Elizabeth Warren, Mazie Hirono, Adam Schiff, Amy Klobuchar, who wrote a letter in support of our complaint. And now we are conducting further research and expanding our work beyond Meta. So we're including TikTok, Google, Amazon, because digital suppression of women's health information is across platforms, but it operates very differently. Like I mentioned earlier, on TikTok, it's so much of it's about language and organic content. On Meta, so much of it is about paid content. So we're really using strategic advocacy, storytelling, the legal complaint that I mentioned to put pressure on these tech companies to make a change. Um,
mm.
and I'm really looking forward to this next year because there's a lot of interesting things in the works with a potential short film, maybe a legal complaint in the EU with the new Digital Services Act. So we have a couple different kind of prongs that we use to change this issue, but a lot of it's through strategic research and advocacy.
Yeah, very cool. I mean, because it's so neat, the need that you guys are filling. Of, yeah, most people don't have the time. These businesses, like, they don't have the time to do that and to fight these things, so it just keeps going unaddressed. So it's like there does have to be dedicated organizations to actually making a change on this end. And I think what you said about, they change their policy like in the middle of the night, they don't make a big deal about it, and it seems like that's always kind of how these things go. Or even some of the policies are so like buried or use such interesting language that's kind of hard to understand, or it's like really vague. Or, I know on TikTok sometimes like a video just won't perform as well.
Shadow
You don't
banning.
know why. Yeah, shadow banning is so
Mm.
crazy, where it's like people are just trying to figure out, and you get no notification, you get no information, especially when people like sometimes, are relying on platforms like these for their income and for, their job stability, that you can just kind of, it is given and it is taken away, and you don't know what invisible rule you broke, which is pretty scary when it's like, oh, maybe I used a word that the algorithm does not like or does not promote.
Yeah, and talk about mental health, right? If your income and your way of living is dependent on remaining in line with these policies that you don't even really have an understanding of, is
Mhm.
it's really deeply stressful. And that's why I think it's also like we're now including content creators in our research, because people create such beautiful, such valuable content, and it's their way of living. And if they're censored or if they're shadow banned, as you said, it can be so extremely stressful and so impactful on their mental health.
Yeah, I mean, it's like comical when you think about like how you said there are doctors, there are nurses, there are, professionals all across social media, and that like they would need to be using an at sign to say like to have the captions for vagina or something. Like that is
Right.
such a funny idea of like,
Yeah.
a gynecologist that's online, like trying to be like, how are we allowed to spell sex on TikTok? Like,
Exactly. Yeah. I was just gonna say it also extends to platforms like ChatGPT. Like a couple weeks ago, we had tested like asking ChatGPT, "Can you explain the function of the clitoris?" And it gave a content warning. Then, "Can you explain the function of the penis?" Didn't give a content warning. So it's really like, why is vagina a bad word and penis isn't, right?
that is crazy. That's so upsetting.
Yeah, it is. It's really upsetting. I agree.
It's just so blatant too. Like,
I know. I
damn.
know.
So I wonder, I'm curious about how you see like the self-love and self-care um kind of intersect with intimacy justice. Like, I think we hear a lot now about doing things to take care of yourself, kind of the intersection that has with being a woman and some of the overarching messages that women get growing up, that they're meant to care for others and that, you know, their kind of support and needs are secondary, which I think is changing. And like, we are hearing more um, about that and becoming more aware of it. But I'm interested in like the intersection with the intimacy justice and how maybe anybody listening can take some actionable steps to kind of foster their own practices in their daily lives, or kind of have their own uh, sense of rebellion or pushback against some of the societal messages that are maybe putting pressure on.
Yeah, I love your use of the word rebellion or pushback because I think in our work it really feels like simply learning about your body and learning about sex and pleasure, so to speak, is a really rebellious act. Look, or at least in the frame of these tech companies. So I think when we think about like the intersection of intimacy justice and digital censorship and self care, I think a lot of it comes to like being like a pleasure activist and talking about sex and sexuality in a positive, joyful, pleasurable way in our everyday lives. Because I think that just the constant silencing of content, of voices, of pain is really exhausting. And the work really rooted in the work that we do is wanting to expand women's voices, wanting to platform women's voices. And when I say women, I mean women and people of diverse genders as well. And I really think that for me personally, like pleasure really comes into that because pleasure is like in the frame of big tech and suppression. It's a very rebellious act
Mm,
to feel good and to know about your body and to know about, sex education and to be aware of these things. And to speak with those around you about it. I think that when we're talking so much about the digital world, you can almost forget just the interpersonal world with your friends and your family and people around you. It's really important to open up these dialogues on why women's bodies are so repressed, so silenced in this part of the universe, let's say.
yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think, I've been talking with some of my like girlfriends lately about, you know, we were kind of talking about the concept of gossip or like gab. That's what people, it's like always like, oh, you gotta do the recap after you hang out with people,
Yeah.
and you gotta gab. Like you gotta like, and we were like, I wonder, like this feels important because it's almost like this thing of like, for women throughout history, it's like kind of like the gossip and the gab. It's like being like, is your experience like my experience? Like, have you, do you know this too? Like, can you relate to me? Because we don't get that on like a larger scale as often. So
Totally.
it's like, women getting together and like chatting about, their date or something. That is also really important
Yes.
because then it's like, wait, is this normal? Is this okay? Or like, what would happen if women never talked about their experience with sex with each other? Before that was, more socially acceptable, or if women didn't have a space like kind of behind closed doors to talk about it, it's like you just wouldn't know, oh, this pain is not normal, or like I shouldn't be, just grinning and bearing it with certain parts of my experience. And so I really like kind of like uh I don't know, like reclaiming or like bringing
bringing
more value to like what
it
the
the
Gab is doing for girls, where it's like, yeah, this is how women have started to recognize and speak up about things all throughout history,
Yeah,
is by
it's so
first,
important.
yeah, first turning to each other, turning to your experience and sharing it with people that you trust, and then being like, okay, wait, something's going on here.
Yeah, because if we can't do that in the digital world, and we should be able to, but I think there's so much power in community and in talking about experiences. And like, I think that personally, like, I try to live by the idea that like there's no such thing as like you're not having a unique experience. You are having a unique experience in like the way that you feel in your body and like your emotional makeup, but like we all share this like crazy situation, and there is so much validation in speaking with people around you about your experiences, whether that's sexual or otherwise.
Mhm.
But I think that I really like your point about like the value of, I've been using the word lately, yapping. Like the
Yapping, yeah.
value of yapping is so intensely important in our lives. And yeah, really sharing and feeling visible and feeling seen in those experiences, because online, like I said, people are not feeling seen, and we're fighting that they are, and I think they will be, but for now,
For now, we yap
definitely
on.
yap away.
Yap away. Yeah, so I love that. I wonder, like, kind of if you could get a message out to people on, you know, everybody becoming kind of this advocate for themselves, like even in their own interpersonal circle, or if someone, does take it further into their work, talking to their employers, or, anybody that's listening that might also be a therapist or work in client facing roles, like talking to clients, bringing this awareness in. Like, what do you think are some ways that people can promote intimacy justice within their own communities, and maybe like broader society at large too?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think first to like plug CIJ, Center for Intimacy Justice, shortened CIJ, like we love to share about our work. So I think like, yeah, first to plug CIJ, like, follow us on socials, like sign up for our newsletter. We're always like trying to get the word out and raise awareness for this issue, which is really important. Once I think there's an awareness that sexual health information is censored online, the more people that know, the better. Because, like I said, I think it's very widespread in like at least my current cultural setting. Like it's egregious. And then in terms of like people with client facing roles, I mean, I think like knowing that women's health in this day and age is still really deeply stigmatized. I think people
Mhm.
really know that, especially now with the Dobbs ruling. But I think having that understanding and that awareness that we can't use the word vagina online. Um, People don't want to talk, or people can't talk about sex online because they're not able to. So really
Mhm.
keeping that at the forefront, and not getting, I think for me at least, like I exist very much in my personal life in the circle of people who are really comfortable talking about bodies and sexuality, but that's not the case. And I think really keeping that in mind, and like I said before, like speaking to others as much as you can about these topics, and um, holding the idea that women's voices are really, really, really silenced at the moment, and that we want to change that.
Yeah. Yeah, it just adds so much context, so much awareness and perspective. I always want to be talking about all the different facets of our well being and how you work to create a life and to continue, because it's not, there's no end goal, but to continue to cultivate a life that feels really good and feels really balanced and fulfilling and intentional to you. And that the scope of everything that can be included in that is huge. And I think the first kind of part is being like, oh, okay, this might be a part of what's impacting my experience as well. Like, now I have more awareness on what the experience for women or anybody that is in that diverse gender category is online, and how some of that is not equitable, not welcoming, not as accepting, and that might be impacting me like on a personal level. I mean, it is. And also, like, you know, tapping in with your own sensitivity and, um, response to that, because everybody's going to have a different response and, yeah, different experiences. If you have experienced pain and you didn't have the access to information, then it might be really draining on your energy to be bumping up against these barriers, or to be learning, even listening to us talk about uh, these barriers that are so unfair. And there is like a lot of righteous anger around that, but kind of bringing in that context of like, okay, this is a part of my life. It's a part of the world that we're living in. And so, you can ask yourself things like, what do I want to do about this? Or what do I need to do for myself, knowing that this is a part of the context?
Yeah, and I really think I really like your point about how does this impact me psychologically? Because I think even what my point before about like, in my personal life, like we're really comfortable. But no, I think you're right. Like pushing up against these barriers all the time really it has an effect on how we view our bodies. Obviously, there's still so many products that are like also misleading, like, vaginal washes and things of that nature that are really teaching us that our bodies are dirty or that our vaginas need to be cleaned. And I think that that's really well taken, Hayden, that like these things do impact our psyche and these things are exhausting. And to feel that your body is, knowingly stigmatized or not is really, really, really impactful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just been so good to talk to you and have you on. I feel like, we could probably go on for hours and hours more, because this is just so fascinating. I feel like I've just started to scratch the surface on this side of, I don't know, women's issues and kind of being a consumer of the internet. And yeah, it's just been so great. And I love what the Center for Intimacy Justice and you and Jackie and everybody else are doing, and be really excited to continue to see where y'all take things.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for your time. I really, really appreciated this conversation and had so much fun. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for listening, guys. Please let me know what you think. As Carol said, follow Center for Intimacy Justice, keep up with them. And also, if you have any other questions or thoughts, like, please just reach out to me on Instagram, or you can find my email if you prefer that method, and just keep the conversation going.